Good almost afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session of our MSDI Research Seminar Series. For those colleagues that I haven't met face-to-face, my name is Shirin Malikpour. I'm an associate professor at MSDI working in interdisciplinary research. And I'd like to first start by acknowledging the custodian owners of the land we are all working on. In my case, it's the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. This forum, the research seminar series at MSDI, is basically a platform for us to come together and exchange ideas, concepts, methodologies, and our approach to different topics and research projects, all related to sustainable development. And we always invite experts and academics from different disciplines to really come and talk to their research that in one way or another relates to sustainable development, which is the core focus of MSDI. Today we have Dr. Liz Taylor. Liz is a great colleague at the Faculty of what we call MADA, Monash Art Design Architecture. Liz is a senior lecturer in urban planning and design. Prior to joining Monash, she has been at RMIT and also at Melbourne Uni at RMIT as a Vice Chancellor's Research Fellow in Centre for Urban Research, and also she was a McKinsey Fellow at the University of Melbourne. And those of you who are familiar with these schemes and names like McKinsey Fellow, you basically know that this is one of the most prestigious grants for early career researchers at Melbourne Uni, and probably just a couple of people every year get it. So Liz was one of them. She's now at Monash, and her research is very much taking historical perspective to how cities change over the long term, and also what role the policy plays in doing that. Her current research projects are really diverse. She looks at issues around car parking policies, Australia's new city projects, affordable housing, as well as approaches to industrial land. Today, she is actually bringing that historical perspective to us and is going to talk to us about the history of the future of transport, revisiting plans for motor cars and monorails in 20th century new cities. So I'll just stop here, hand over to you, Liz. And
okay.
I think there's some sound going on in the background. Yeah.
Hang on.
If everyone could please mute yourselves, that would be great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so I'll just hand over to Liz, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Sharon, and thank you to MSDI for hosting me. And as you can see today, the topic is quite esoteric. It's the sort of thing that makes me grateful to work at a university, and particularly in the field of urban history, because it's sort of what you might call a Gunzel topic. It's the history of transport technology. So some of the pictures here are of planned monorails for planned new cities of the 20th century, particularly in the 1960s and 70s, and none of these were ever built. This is an automatic a pallet system proposed for Berwick in Melbourne. This one was proposed for North Bucks Monorail City, which later became Milton Keynes, and this one here was for a planned city in South Australia called Monato, which was also never built. So I'll be talking about systems of transport technology that weren't executed, often in cities that themselves weren't executed. That's the esoteric part, is looking back at a kind of failed chapter in planning and transport history. But the focus today is to try and think at a bigger level, hence the title, The History of the Future of Transport, thinking about what can we learn from that role of the kind of futuristic, because the monorail, for better or worse, it has this kind of intrinsic future aspect, science fiction motif to it. What do we learn by looking back on the role that was envisioned for this kind of transport, and particularly in the context of planned new cities? So these kinds of monorails and associated technologies, they of course have a longer history and they continue to exist today, But the history I'm focusing on today is around the 1960s and 70s, when they had this kind of fantastic fleeting role in new towns or plant new cities. And I'm not even giving an exhaustive account of that. I'm just reflecting on some of those and the lessons today. So the context, why would you do this? I feel like I cannot do a presentation about monorails without mentioning The Simpsons. We could actually play the Monorail song, but people of a certain age probably can't think about monorails without referencing the Simpsons episode. And part of the Simpsons episode on the monorail, because this was the storyline concerned a kind of charlatan suggesting that what their town really needed was a monorail system. And of course, it was not only dangerous but stupid and ended up kind of crashing. And the lesson was that this was a very hubristic, futile idea for the town. And that's part of a broader kind of memory of the monorail now. But the personal reason why I got into this topic was partly through this ARC Discovery project, which I share with David Nichols and others, which is looking at Australia's new cities, past, present, and future. And an overarching goal of that research project is actually to tackle that simplified narrative about planning experiments and whether they failed or not. So we're looking back in more archival sense at what was intended and executed from, is that a question, or is that someone not muted, I think?
I think it's someone not being muted.
Okay, cool. So it's partly that project, and it's partly out of my interest in car parking, which I'll give a bit of a brief potted history on now. So through looking at new city proposals from the 1960s in particular for Australia, as in other parts of the world, monorails and guideways and kind of associated what were then considered high technology transport proposal solutions were proposed. And what I'm looking at today is the fact that they didn't come out of nowhere. They actually came out of a kind of broader set of values about planning for urban development and planning in a way in response to the impacts of motorization. How and why did planners deploy these kinds of solutions to cities? But really, I'm centering this kind of relationship. Monorails didn't come out of nowhere. They came pretty much in tandem as response to cars and motorization. Just as I'll make a case that, as well as having their own kind of separate histories and rationales, new towns were partly a response to the impacts of cars and trying to live with cars and live with motorization. Monorails were a kind of further extension of that, where as motorization escalated and the scale of traffic in towns just escalated, monorails was the next step to try and retain some of the principles of new town planning with a technological advance within that. So I'm looking at this kind of overlap. Monorails have their own history, new towns have their own history, and of course 20th century automobility has its own history, which kind of introduce each one, but then I'm trying to bring it back to how did new town planners respond to cars, and how much of their kind of ideas were a response to the impacts of cars, and how did monorails and futuristic technologies enter that kind of logic being deployed as a way of coping with the problems of motorization. And thinking about what are the lessons here for sustainable transport and sustainable city planning today, and why would you think of that kind of legacy given that they weren't built and sort of easily go in that spoof category? One is that 20th century automobility, so planning in response to cars, defines the conditions of many cities today, including Melbourne. That a lot of our urban fabric, our systems of governance are based around private car ownership, and the way planners accommodated that in the 20th century, of which car parking is one example I'm very familiar with. There's also this kind of parallel issue that any kind of new transport ideas that come along or disruptions, they're framed in relation to that system of 20th century kind of automobility. So electric cars, shared cars, or mobility as a service, so that's decoupling the transport from the infrastructure of the item ownership. All these things, at least in a Western context, are placed on top of how we get around primarily by car now. So a lot of the conflict and disruption is around accommodating a city that was planned for a certain version of cars and coming up with the limitations of that approach. And we also have the near constant kind of arrival of utopian or futuristic transport solutions, or the future of transport. And they have kind of, some of them are versions of public transport or mass transit. So the trackless tram, for example, is one sort of later version of transport for public transit. But we also have these kind of things that hark a bit back to the modified car transport, which the APT system was, such as the Hyperloop, which is this crazy scheme, frankly crazy scheme for underground tunnels that drag cars around in Los Angeles. But within that same kind of world is thinking about, can we make different versions of cars, so electric cars, shared cars that are kind of better versions of cars, and also can we facilitate a city that isn't dominated by cars in the way that 20th century cities have been. And of course, there's a broader world context, which is probably more relevant to the audience today, the SDGs, is that whilst the examples I'm talking about today are very much Eurocentric past examples, motorization is still happening today. Cities are undergoing that transition to car ownership, and new cities are continuing to be built, including imaginaries about what transport might look like. So the fundamental questions around sustainability in transport: can we live with, can we kind of make a better version of cars, as planners have often sought to? What is the role of technology and of infrastructure, and how do we learn from the way that the future has been imagined before? And some of the images on the side here, I noticed this headline the other day: 100 years since cars drove pedestrians off the road. So we're looking at now a century of streets in American cities, in that case, being remodeled to sort of seem like they were always built for cars to be parked and to move, and not for people. But then there's this kind of two matching articles from National Geographic. This one, The Revolution Is Here, from a couple of years ago, talking specifically about electric transportation, and from 1969, The Future of Transport, which was sadly also talking about electric transportation, but it's sort of looking forward to these kind of elevated guideway systems as well. What happens when these kinds of ideas do or do not come to pass? And these kind of little clippings here are from some new city proposals that are floating around at the moment. One is Nusantara, the new Indonesian capital, which I was doing a bit of search for this. I knew that the main planners are kind of hoping to keep cars out of this new capital, but I hadn't realized that there was a kind of high-tech aspect to it. So there's a direct parallel there. It says here that they're going to build an air mobility ecosystem. I think that's also known as a flying car. And the line in Saudi Arabia, which I'm not sure if is a real thing or not, but it's meant to be the future of urban living. It's centered on I don't think it's a monorail, but it's the equivalent kind of thing: mass transit, car-free, linear city, all of which harks back to much older concepts. So first, something I'm much more familiar talking about, cars and automobility. So just a kind of potted look at how cars and the infrastructures of cars being planned into our cities today. And when I say our, that's very time and geographically specific, but car parking, it's essential especially to a 20th century version of automobility, because where you think of cars as always moving, 95% of the time they are stationary. So as soon as we started to get mass car ownership and use to start to simultaneously think about and then forget about the need to actually store them and that infrastructure of storage. And two really basic ways that happens is remodeling cities built before cars with car parking. So that's in Carlton, and taking a street built before cars and modifying it for storage, or designing suburbs and cities around car parking. So this kind of extent of surface car parking and sunshine, which I'm aware that David's in the audience. He'll probably say, well, that one wasn't exactly a car park. Not the best example. It's just a good example of how much surface car parking goes into suburban kind of cities. And that's quote from Erin Ben Joseph: "We demand convenient parking everywhere we go and learn not to see the vast unsightly spaces that result." So I've kind of learned this over years of thinking about parking, that most people only notice it when they're looking for it and they think there's nothing of it. As soon as you find it, you forget it's there, but it's actually a huge part of cities. There's often a lot of it. So that's the extreme example, is a downtown in the US, Buffalo. The map shows surface and garage parking in the downtown area, which accounts for over half of the land area in that city. Often the reason why there's so much parking is because it's planned. So it's part of the planning system. The zoning system is that every new use that comes in, you have to provide a certain amount of car parking. And most car parking, in generalizing here, appears free. Of course, to the user anyway. Most people, when I say that, will think, well, I paid for it at the airport or in the CBD, but in most contexts in a city like Melbourne, you don't directly pay for parking. That's from a Vista, a travel survey about who paid for parking at the destination. And it's a little bit deceptive because it includes parking at your own house, I think, but at something like 95% of it, there was no fee. And the tiny slithers that do involve a fee, it's in that specific context of street parking in the CBD, airport, university parking, often things like that. Most of it, it's a lot of it, and the people that use it don't pay for it. It's something that's baked into the cost of building land and construction at the outset. So the reason we primarily have that situation of there being a lot of it, you don't think about it, and it doesn't usually cost you anything, is because in large part of parking, planning approaches or conventional parking planning approaches from, it's either called predict and provide or supply-based, conventional, various kind of language around that. But this cartoon by Rebecca Clements, it's based on some work by Paul Barter that's since been kind of expanded, but I like the kind of really simplified characterization of how planners and cities accommodate car parking. The conventional approach is that you're thinking of any kind of new use, we have to have a site-based response to provide enough parking for that use. So anything that's built, they have to provide their own parking. There's a ratio for that provision, usually, ironically, to stop overspill onto the street, but the street parking is usually free or largely free. So it is a kind of Sisyphean task, like constantly trying to provide enough that people don't park on the street, but that's the idea. And that response is kind of formalizing parking in a sense. It came out of a response to widespread motorization and the pressures of parking just being everywhere in the mid-20th century in places like Melbourne. The alternatives are kind of management approach, and that's probably more typical of a CBD area where the car parking is considered as a kind of asset to be distributed based on need and sort of milking the most out of the infrastructure. So you're looking at things like timing, parking meters and permits and things like that to make sure parking is available when needed. And market-based parking, which is the kind of rarer version, but that's again based on Rebecca Clements' excellent work on parking in Japan, which is the inverse, where rather than having the street being the place where people can park their car, the street is for traffic and pedestrians, and there's just no capacity to park your car on the street. It's entirely a market-based real estate situation. And the interesting kind of implication of that is partly that planners don't spend all their time thinking about parking, which in my experience in Australia, they generally do. So some of the issues with that conventional 20th century approach to parking is that you disguise all the costs, even just the cost of the land and the building that goes into it. You're also trading off what you could use that land for, whether it was a market-based use or a sort of more civic use. Places to put cars could be something else, but we instead plan for the storage of cars. It also has been accused of oversupplying parking. So even relative to how much people use cars, it's providing a clear incentive to definitely drive and definitely park. And it is a strong determinant of travel mode choice is the availability and price of parking. And then the fact that planners systematically make sure that every destination has a large amount of parking and simultaneously trying to encourage them to use public transport is considered by parking researchers to be problematic. And the main kind of famous critic is Donald Shoup, the high cost of free parking. And the way this often plays out is around conflict when you sort of planners or others are trying to shift the use, perhaps it's street space in particular, towards something else other than private car storage. It's a very political flashpoint, and that's how I got interested in parking in part. Originally was realizing that so many conflicts about urban change, urban development, even things like urban greening came down to the pain of paying for parking or changing parking or otherwise kind of bringing to the foreground our reliance on free, easy car parking. And there's some kind of snippets of stories around conflict over parking, and these kind of indicate as well that it's not a purely instrumental kind of question of how much parking costs, or it's a lot more than that. So I'm not exactly dwelling on that today, but it's clearly a political question as well. It's about equity and perceived equity and people's rights to space, given that we're often kind of hybridized into being cars. If you're introducing parking fees or time limits, then that's interpreted often as being a direct comment on someone's right or ability to access space. So that's a real challenge in terms of thinking about a city and its futures, given also that even if you take out the kind of emissions part of it, if we went fully electric, you're still talking about incredible displacement of space that comes through automobility. We're also talking about impacts on children's mobility, safety, and again, the opportunity cost about how else you might use a city. If we sort of center that political right-based automobility, there are costs, short-term and long-term. This is from some work I did on how Melbourne got to this point. I have presented this bit quite a few times before, so I'll try and skip over it, but the main reference there is elephant in the scheme. What we're looking at was, how did Melbourne get to that approach to parking strategically? Was this something that was planned? And if so, how do the mechanisms for planning for car parking match up to broader strategic planning goals, including around transport and sustainability? We looked at this first plan for Melbourne, which wasn't implemented, but it's a good kind of history document, the 1929 plan for Melbourne. And one of the interesting things there is that this is in a context of increasing car ownership and chaos. So this is photos in that document of cars being parked all over the street. And at that point, planners behind this document saw this as being an unreasonable imposition of private cars. So the claims of the motorists for greater facilities are persistent and frequently unreasonable. And this plan was proposing to take a much more, taking back the street from cars and having a more planned a metropolitan body for managing car parking and trying to push car parking presence back off the public street. But this was not implemented, and by the time you actually get to an implemented strategic plan for Melbourne, not only had motorisation escalated again, but the kind of norms around the expectation of cars to access parking space had become pretty much embedded. So, and also they've got that influence from planners from America. So one of the direct links here is the Charles Bennett from Los Angeles Planning Department visited Melbourne on invitation and spoke a lot about what Melbourne at that time, 1953, could learn from Los Angeles, including really about cars and how to park them. And that gets reflected in the 1954 scheme for Melbourne, which was implemented and was incredibly influential. And also I often admire it for the way that the strategy matches up with the mechanism. The strategy talks about essentially responding to increased car ownership, the possibility that some parts of Melbourne would really suffer from not having a lot of car parking, and the necessity of planning for convenient access by car. So older shopping strips, we're seeing that, this is a problem. We have to kind of redesign them to accommodate car parking. And newer areas, they're looking directly to this kind of Victor Gruen model of the pedestrianised mall surrounded by the sea of car parking. And part of that plan was the introduction of minimum car parking requirements. That's just a model example of that kind of restructuring that went on. And then I in that paper went through the fact that by the time you get to the early 2000s, the vision stated by strategic planners for Melbourne had more or less completely flipped around. Instead of having this kind of shopping mall car park as being the American thing to strive for, it was then the thing that could be something else. So taking that surface car park and turning it into urban forest and density and diversity of land uses. This is the shift in vision anyway, and this had started possibly a couple of decades earlier with urban consolidation. But the actual underlying process for planning for car parking didn't change accordingly. What I've argued over a few papers is that in Melbourne and many other cities of the similar timeline, you still have the basic assumption that you have to plan for cars, you have to plan for car parking, and that's it reflected here. And this is the original minimum parking requirements from the 1950s. And today they're still there. You can argue your way out of them. They're much more complicated. There's like 17 pages of these regulations now. And that's a big focal point for conflict around change in Melbourne. So there's that tweaking, I guess, and more complexity around it, but fundamentally it's still a system of planning for 20th century automobility. And variations on that are where a lot of the kind of conflict and, I guess, anxiety around the city focuses, for better or worse. So some of the disruptions around car parking, by which I mean 20th century urban mobility or car ownership, you're seeing it particularly in public space. So the curb space, new claims to it. So particularly with COVID, demands for more hospitality space, public open space, expanding parks to take up car parking. Recently had the visit from Salvador Rueda from Barcelona, the super blocking idea. We could remake the city, but we need the car parking. Conversion of some of the off-street parking where possible. But then you have the sort of gradual arrival of variations on cars. This is a shared car. We have the shared electric cars. All of them have their own particular way of occupying curb space. And there's still cars, there's still a version of financialized mobility, but they also have to come up against the way that the planning system and the infrastructure of the city is built around a particular model of car ownership and is having to adapt, including here you've got the people plugging their electric cars in on the sidewalk. And you've got that kind of longer term vision or competing visions around, will we be moving to electric vehicles, but also will we be moving to driverless autonomous vehicles, and would that be a good thing? So that takes up a bit of space in the kind of planning and transport debates, is around, should we be moving in that way, and what version of automation we'll be looking at? Will it be kind of a shared public transport version, or will it be just bigger cars without drivers? That's all playing out now. And while it's playing out, we're also still living with the kind of practical reality that there are, in Australia, for example, just more and more cars, and they're actually bigger and more embedded in our daily lives than ever. So that's the kind of framework of what we've inherited about 20th century automobility. That's a good reference about that contestation of the curb. So now bringing in new towns into this. And with the language of new towns here, obviously that has a generic meaning, a new city or a new town. I'm evoking here a specific kind of planning ideology and process about planned cities, planned self-contained cities, and aspirations around that. Often what we're called new towns were existing townships that were expanded. It's really typically referring to the process and the level of integration that went into those, and also the kinds of outcomes that planners were trying to achieve. And I'm making the argument here that new town planners, and I'm just drawing on a few Eurocentric examples here, we're in no small part responding to the pressures of car ownership. We're trying to cater to it. Of course, you have a longer lineage around the Garden City and the Ebenezer Howard idea of trying to get, counter the pull of urbanization, the attractions of industrialization and the economy there, and retain the positive aspects of the countryside. So that's a fundamental lineage to planned new cities as well, is trying to balance city and country in a self-contained town and to limit some of the worst effects of larger cities. But in terms of the actual car component, one of the key kind of people involved here is Clarence Stein, also Lewis Mumford, both American planners. And some of their concepts, ideas directly spread to British new town planners and across to Australia. I don't want to emphasize the sort of single person, but it is interesting when you see the idea travel. and the unlikely context of the United States and new towns. So I've got a lot out of this book towards new towns for America, where it's drawing mainly on some pretty experimental, quite small examples in the US at that time. Radburn, New Jersey, which was intended as a kind of new town, self-contained town, but really was more of an experimental layout. And 3 US Greenbelt cities, which were built by the New Deal administration in the 1930s, Green Hills, Greenbrook, Greendale, don't ask me which one is which. And in this, Clarence Stein is looking at, what were these trying to achieve and what could be the lessons in terms of expanding that in the US moving forward. You can also see similar ideas in a film that was commissioned by Clarence Stein, Lewis Mumford and others for the 1939 World's Fair called The City. That I recommend that. But what I'm interested in here is how much the kind of response to the car threads through that thinking. So in the introduction, it's the new town idea is referred to as setting for safe motor age living and a town in which people could live peacefully with the automobile, or rather in spite of it. And this is kind of this attitude of people like Lewis Mumford and Clarence Stein that cars and increasing traffic were a direct threat to everything they valued about city living, urbanization, but also just quality of life generally. So there was a fairly clear framing around trying to not necessarily stop car ownership, but to live in spite of it, design your way out of the impacts here. Some of the principles that are put forward towards new towns for America, and which really are threaded through most of the new town models. One is separating pedestrians and automobiles. So physically and generally through design, trying to keep them apart. Sometimes that's through the classic underpasses. So they would plan a network of footpaths, cycleways quite separately from cars and have that kind of continuity facilitated in part by grade separation through underpasses. Also through the orientation of the housing, rather than orienting the housing towards the street and the car, you're orienting towards open spaces, commons, inner parks, the civic centres, which were centred on schools and other leisure facilities. Swimming pools is a nice one you see a lot, shopping centres and so on. The neighbourhood unit, which is a model of self-containment similar to the Garden City, but where you've got the school and other institutions at the centre. The very perimeter is where car traffic is directed towards, and everything inside that is meant to be car-free or certainly car minimal and safely connected by foot or cycling. A lot of emphasis on children and children's safety, because it's strange to think about now in an Australian context where the solution to children in cities is to just have them in cars, but the context at the beginning of the 20th century is that most children, to the extent that you had a defined childhood, you would play on the street, and they were the ones that were getting killed by cars. So part of the planning response was to provide places for children to play off the street and separate the cars out. And in a new town context, it's centering the children, their safety and their access, independent mobility using today's language. And it wasn't just confined to design. It was often also about that economic containment as well. So planning for employment and local destinations so that people weren't having to commute long distances. So that's some imagery from the Clarence Stein book. Small children play in safety on the footpath. And here's the kind of characterization that I put on new towns. And I'd be interested in David and others' response, but basically that new towns, 20s to 1950s, it's these garden cities ideas and the confidence that you can solve this through design. You can live with the car safely. But by the time you get to the 1960s, in Britain, Australia, earlier in America, the scale of car ownership just tips over to being, the attention turns towards technology, including monorails.
Sorry to interrupt, just giving you the 5-minute signal. If we could wrap up within 5 minutes, and we'll have time for a question and answer as well.
All right, that's a Radburn idea, the neighbourhood unit. and that kind of separation of cars and parking, the underpasses, the centering of the children, above all, a town for children. So it is quite a nostalgic kind of imagery, I think. But looking at the US, they found, well, there are limits to that. It wasn't executed in full, and there are kind of compromises where you end up just having policed traffic instead. Then looking at, I clearly definitely haven't allowed enough time to give a rapid view through this. The British Newtowns version, a larger scale execution of Newtown ideas through the Newtowns Act 1946, a much bigger context about post-war reconstruction, but within that 21 designated new towns over 3 different waves, they had in common a lot of those kinds of ideas about containment and pedestrian separation. And over time, they became much more in response to cars. So the first Newtown Stevenage, it's kind of premised on cycling, basically. That's an imagery there and some of the planning behind it. But later new towns, they started to have to adapt to higher rates of car ownership, so garaging. So you go from assuming that 8% of residents would have cars to 25, 50%, and gradually having to evolve the model for how you do the housing, how you do everything to adapt to the car ownership. And that's from that review there. The constant presence of parked cars is testimony to the inadequate provision for the motor vehicle. They're just interesting because they're just sort of layouts of where you would put cars, still maintaining this separation of pedestrians, but also providing for garaging for ownership. In terms of the Australian lineage here, we had some earlier versions of Newtown planning, Elizabeth, which is characterised as being very much like Crawley or Stevenage, but for Australian car ownership, Canberra Newtowns. But I think the context in which large-scale new city thinking in Australia came about at the federal level is more in this later stage of motorisation, where the scale of traffic in large cities became a much stronger motivation for looking to new solutions for transport and urban planning. So that's partly coming from this book, Tetlow and Goss, that looked at British new towns, the best conditions for coping with the motor age, but also could only be described as disappointing. And there's this whole wave of anxiety, aesthetic and otherwise, around the impacts of car ownership and car infrastructure in cities. And that's part of the turn in Australia to an interest in the problems of our larger cities in Australia. So the context here, through the 60s, is quite a bit of research, Max Neutzer, pronunciation there, for example, looking at the diseconomies of scale and pointing to the idea that there are just fundamental problems with large cities in Australia. They've reached a size where things are no longer tenable, including around traffic and car ownership. And this new town thinking comes into the Whitlam administration in 1972, responding by setting up a program for new city construction, including some of those ideas about employment containment, but also looking to technology as part of that. And it's also within an Australian context of decentralisation agendas being a constant kind of narrative. So that's Whitlam, 1968. So it's this kind of interest in, can we rebalance Australia's population? Can we start plan entire new communities? This is a map of the planned growth centres for Australia from 1972, 1975. Some of these were built. Albury-Wodonga is probably the most extant, successful example of the growth centre. But the ones I'll speak to today, Monato and Berwick, various versions of not built. And I'm going to give you the whirlwind tour of the monorail, how this fits into this. The later stages of Newtown, planning new cities, including in Australia, there's a look towards the technology part of it. Acknowledging that there's a sort of more pragmatic history of monorails, that it's just a form of transport. For example, Wuppertal has a monorail system. But for whatever reason, it's always had this science fiction space age meaning. It's featured in the movie Metropolis. And monorails were also part of a series of World's Fairs, Seattle, New York, and otherwise. And that seems to be part of why they are future imaginary. Also theme parks in Disneyland. And this is another contributor to that space age future part was Archigram Plug-in City, which is a pretty far out conceptual city for a kind of vertical modular city, which included a series of monorails connecting the components of the city. And this seemed to feed into new town planners featuring monorails in their ideas. So some, I'm sure there are more, but the ones that I've looked at, North Bucks New City, which also known as Pooleyville, which became Milton Keynes, was designed, that's the picture here, as a monorail city. Runcorn, another UK new town, was intended to be a monorail city, became a bus instead. One proposed for Uganda, Tama New Town in Japan, Berwick and Minato I'll talk to you today. So the one in North Bucks Monorail City, it was driven by the local council and Frederick Pooley, and it was intended to be here quiet, automated, high speed, offering freedom, choice, flexibility and mobility. And a lot of this was about children's mobility, the idea that cars benefit some but not children, and they need to benefit from this kind of transport technology as well. And this is a great piece on the history of North Bucks Monorail City, where Ortolano talks about turning to the monorail not as a rejection of the car but as a response to its success. Automobile's triumph required a reimagined city. So it's being planned as a response to and a kind of competitor to the car. But by the time this new town was actually built, it morphed into not Pooleyville or Monorail City, it became Milton Keynes. So it was replaced by the designation of Milton Keynes 1967. And Milton Keynes was the last new town in the UK. It had a lot of the classic ideas of new town thinking still there, including an interest in pedestrian access, but the monorails was jettisoned. And they're explaining there the plan as we had to demolish the plan and agree it was not implementable from this idea that, you know, we just can't afford it, basically. I would like to give a couple more minutes on these ones, Sharon, sorry. I'm trying. So that's the kind of lesson in death of the plan for the kind of futuristic solution, and Milton Keynes became here this kind of very car-oriented city. It has a lot of things going for it, but not a monorail. Berwick MetroTown, very similar to the Pooleyville proposal for North Bucks Monorail City. This was a response by the local shire in 1973 or 4, I think. Melbourne was expanding at that time, and this is during the Whitlam growth era, growth centres program. The local shire wanted to create their own self-contained metro town. So not to be absorbed into the expanding city, but to be self-contained, have their own civic identity and infrastructure. And they engaged Loader and Bailey consultants to put together this idea for a metro town. It had a lot of really innovative mechanisms, including value capture and including a monorail. So they put forward these ideas for consideration by the Whitlam administration. It included John Loader, who was an engineer and planner. His proposal for what was called an automated personal transport system, or APT. And he proposed this model of transportation for Australia generally, but very, very much in that spirit of responding to the car. So it, as well as being a public transport, you could put your car on a pallet as well. And he framed it as a response to the deterioration of our cities as a result of car traffic. That's some illustrations there. The Berwick MetroTown would incorporate these monorails, small monorails carrying 4 to 6 passenger public vehicles, or you could put your car on it and load it on this kind of pallet system, computer orientated. So there's great illustrations here. And if successful, will eventually replace the private car. So competing for the technology here, also centered on trying to keep the center of Berwick MetroTown car free and responding to the issues of traffic in terms of its public realm impacts. It had all these kind of equity ideas, which I think are quite interesting to revisit, and it integrated with an on-demand bus. All these kinds of quite utopian and quite familiar ideas now, but of course it was shelved. I say of course because this is the cynicism in which we plan today. MetroTown floundered. Berwick itself was developed, but it was just a suburb of Melbourne, certainly no monorail. Apparently the easement still exists though. And my final example, Minato. This was part of the Whitlam growth program, meant to be a new city to accommodate the growth of Adelaide at that time. had this amazing lineage of planners and architects involved, series of plans, studying the location and coming up with a visualization. So I won't get the details of that, but one of the versions of the plan included this civic centre set around an artificial lake and what they called a honky tonk. This is similar to that Arctogram city. And this was to be accessed by a monorail in the centre here. And that was partly through an emphasis on the civic space and making sure that that city centre was car-free, where citizens can perform their city functions without the interference of the motor car. They were still catering for a lot of car ownership, but the idea was that you would park your car on the outskirts and then use the monorail to access the city. But Monato was never built at all, let alone its monorail. So that's the aftermath of the monorail, the Whitlam era, Whitlam dismissal, growth centres program wound up. Monato was never built. Berwick became a suburb. Monorail City became Milton Keynes. The whole aesthetic of new towns has become unfashionable. Planning for crime prevention was sort of the death of the underpass in some ways. But I'm thinking about what are the more nuanced lessons. One is what they were trying to do with monorails is actually very relevant to sustainability ideas today in terms of livability, children's mobility, environmental considerations. So is there something to be learned from what they're trying to do, if not actually execute it now, but sort of reflect on those ideas and center them again? Of course, the limits and the critiques here, these were very much tech-focused mega projects. Why were they so science fiction oriented? Why were they so big? The hubristic aspect of it and the failure of it has had a legacy for planning and public transport, which has been quite negative. And then just reflecting that there are some sort of built examples of monorails. They don't have to be symbolic of everything. They've been built in airports and whole downtown areas. The Tama monorail, interestingly, was built. It was meant to be a self-contained monorail, but ended up being a linear monorail to the city. So there's some examples there. These are things that I'm trying to think about now. When I was talking about this presentation and what it means, some suggestions that have come out, including from peer reviewers, is that really it would be relevant to reflect on Bruno Latour's work on Aramis, or the love of technology, and the failure of this very similar transportation system for Paris in the 1960s to 70s. John Forrester wrote about the planning of downtown monorails in Detroit and Cincinnati. And there's also some work here around what you can learn from failed plans from London and others. So apologies for talking over because it's new material, but over to you if we have time. What are the other kinds of lessons learned? What frameworks are relevant to this kind of historical, esoteric unearthing of plans? And what are the implications for today for cities that are characterized by 20th century plans in relation to the car, but also to other cities which are either motorizing now or trying to build a future with a different kind of transport technology? What can we learn? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Liz. That was great. So I might just really quickly jump into question and answer, given that we have very limited time. I would really appreciate if we could keep both questions and answers as short as possible so that we can manage to cover as many as we can in the amount of time we have left. Is there any question? And feel free to just unmute yourself.
I'd love to hear your corrections as well, because I am suffering from kind of, I think they're great, but then it's like, no, they were stupid. That's why they didn't build them. So, yeah. You know, people, Rob, for example, how would you interpret this in terms of what does it mean for, you know, transitioning towards sustainable transport today? But
I'm happy to go, but I see Stefan has his hand raised, so maybe start with Stefan.
Stefan, go.
Thanks, Rob. Liz, that was fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.
I guess I'll try asking a question. Do you think it's more helpful in terms of, you know, how do we progress towards more sustainable cities to look at these situations as a tragedy of unintended consequences and complexity beyond what people could cope with, or are there specific actors who steered and managed the realities we see in front of us, who need to be rounded up and something done to them? You know, like, should we be looking for villains here, or should we be bemoaning the difficulty humans have in directing the evolution of their environments?
I think that's a fabulous question, Stefan. And that's kind of where I was getting at with the, what do you make of this, or what should I make of it? I think it sounds like Bruno Latour's work is a bit around the understanding what particular people and the interaction between people and technology was and what the consequences were. So there might be a bit of a roundup there. I personally think, and this is part of the motivation for the Newtown's research generally, is that there does need to be a bit more accountability for specific governance and funding decisions that will happen where you just can the whole program and then say, well, that didn't work, did it? So you do have to have a commitment to executing a plan. So, and we have lost a bit of that. I think there's a lesson there around the relationship between planners and anyone with power to the future. Take some more responsibility for it, because you do actually have the capability to have a plan and implement it. Yes, you can learn from it. It might not be as intended, but in a lot of these cases, so Berwick MetroTown, it wasn't tested and failed. It was just the MMBW, the Board of Works, came in and were like, no, this is a dumb idea. We like the way we do things now. That's my kind of characterization. Maybe it's worth testing all those kinds of theories, because there's nothing more intrinsically complex about a monorail than the system of freeways we've built for cars. If the system of automobility wants it to happen, then we can support it. So there's a bit of that, I think. I can see some comments there, Ian. Why is it that monorails get singled out? Yes, yeah, they're just a kind of train. I agree, Ian. There's a sort of symbolic role to them, and I'm trying to unpack why them, and that's where I was going to the Archigram stuff and the World's Fairs. They seem to have this importance as a symbolic thing, but they're also just a train. So why do they have to do everything, and why do they have so much accountability? I'm interested in them partly because of that cultural baggage and the Simpsons episode where it's like, I've built monorails in North Haverbrook, Ogdenville, and all these dumpster fire cities. It seems to stand for the idea that you shouldn't try to do something like that, but it is also just a kind of transport. So, yes.
Rob, please go ahead.
Yes.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Reen. That was an incredibly interesting talk, Liz, and I really enjoyed listening to it. I always enjoy when people go back in history and explain the stuff that we had and that actually never made it. I guess there's lots of things that come to mind. I'm just thinking what kind of question I'll address, but what do you make of some of the European examples, I guess, where there has been more transformative change over the last decades or so in terms of getting cars out of the way? And really, it's not just getting cars out of city centers. I think it's a more fundamental transformation in terms of the relationships between people, mobility, sustainability, and design of urban space. So it's what we call in sort of my kind of field really a regime change, right? So how do you explain that? The fact, so what are the drivers of that successful transformation, and what is preventing that from happening in some of the Australian cities? And I guess that comes down to maybe something that you didn't talk about that much, I'm sure you know a lot more about, is the actual people and the politics behind these imaginaries. So who's voicing and articulating these imaginaries, and what makes some of them more successful and winning over others?
Yeah, they're all good questions. I'll sort of answer the last one first to some extent. There do seem to have been specific consultants involved in both promoting the monorail, and they're often their own system. So there's a kind of clear, like the monorail guy in The Simpsons. But there's also, in terms of new towns in Australia, they're often the same people that killed the monorail in Milton Keynes. They seem to have come out to Australia and decided that, for better or worse, Melton and Sunbury should be planned like this way. So there is a kind of direct people involved. I think David probably speak more directly to that, but there is just the same way that garden cities and the neighbourhood unit travelled through specific people and inculcated there. There does seem to be the same thing about killing the monorail as well as promoting it. Who exactly, I'm still trying to unpack, and I think it's helpful to have a clearer theoretical lens on what I'm trying to explain in terms of, the regime change. And it seems to be the regime change part here is perhaps with the New Cities project, we've been much more specifically interested in the change at the federal level in having a confidence and interest in urban affairs and having solutions to urban planning in Australia, and actually the foresight to plan for new cities and responses to that, to the dismissal of the Whitnell administration. Part of that is saying, well, we don't do that anymore. So there's some clear examples around new cities at that sort of lower level. The transport stuff seems to be much more diffuse, but definitely a shift away from thinking that public transport is viable, thinking that it is sort of something that could be something people want, or that we should be doing, or that we can afford. That's a kind of question for transport historians that I think we should all tackle. And in terms of the European examples, regime change, well, things that the sort of immediate lesson here is, I mentioned that I was at a workshop the other day, and I think there's a lecture tonight by Salvador Rueda from Barcelona speaking about the superblocks transition in Barcelona. Partly it's about improving the bus network, and partly it's about reconfiguring an existing city to not just minimize the presence of traffic, but to reprioritize citizens and people. So there's an ideology there, and he's obviously been brought out here in an effort to translate that to Australia. And it's fascinating to see all the ways in which, there's an appetite for that here, but also the barriers, some of which come down to that kind of my initial interest in some of this, which is just around the car parking and the infrastructure of a city that has been substantially planned around the convenience of car ownership. If you want to have that, you have to actually start giving ground on some of the car parking, and that's super challenging here. I think there's always lessons around demonstrating the possibilities and incremental change, but we are a city here that has been built post motorization, and with car ownership so much more baked in that I don't think that means there isn't the possibility for change, but it does create that kind of, the weight is slightly against it. And you see that in the sadness with which, transport planners in Australia will go to Europe and be like, why can't we have nice things? It is quite depressing, but we should also be able to respond to our own conditions, and that is a challenge there. And there's always this barrier around, well, we're not Amsterdam, or we're not this.
Just a quick response to that. Just saying that's often, I hear it a lot, but European cities weren't European cities 30, 40 years ago. Amsterdam wasn't Amsterdam 40 years ago. So we can actually look at the transformation and see what happened in the past there. And I think that there are some studies obviously which have done that, but I think it would be interesting to compare that into an Australian history. I
think it's a good way of trying to having that conversation that first of all, we weren't always like this. That's partly why I'm interested in the history of car parking and planning. There have been alternative versions of Australian cities, and secondly, the Australian cities have already changed. We have made all these kinds of concessions for better or worse. We are always moving towards the future, and things aren't sort of fixed. So it is useful to kind of try and break out of that, but if I knew the answers, then I'm not sure. And I know I've skipped over a lot of the nuance here, but they're really good questions.
Thanks, thanks, Liz. I think we are 3 minutes already over time, so we might want to try to close it here for people who have to run to other meetings and commitments. Thank you so much, and we would love to continue this conversation. Please feel free to get in touch with Liz. She's available at Monash Mana, so she's an insider. And thank you so much, Liz, for this fascinating presentation.
Yeah, and do get in touch, because I'll be presenting similar material again, and I'm trying to make more out of it. So very much interested in your thoughts. Feel free to email me, and thanks for your patience and attention today.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thanks, Liz.